The Sony A7 series of cameras are designed for the user that wants to do it all. And thanks to its brand new 33 megapixel partially stacked sensor with 16 stops of dynamic range, the Sony A7V is capable of even more. And I've already used this camera for about a week and I've taken around 6,000 images with it. And in this video, I'm gonna share some real-world insights about the camera, share some examples, and tell you who I think this camera is really for. So I got this camera delivered, started unboxing it, and pretty quickly got an email from Sony telling me when I needed to send it back. And unfortunately, this return date fell right in the middle of a family trip to Aruba. So I sent off an email pleading for them to let me hold onto it for just a few extra days so I could bring it with me on my trip and have a bit more time to test. And in the meantime, I used the camera just around the house, and the very first thing I wanted to test was the silent shutter, because this camera comes with a newly designed partially stacked sensor, which is a big deal because the older traditional sensors have a fairly slow sensor readout speed, which is why when you use the silent shutter to take photographs of moving subjects, you get that weird sort of like jello effect. Now, we have had sensor designs for a long time that fix this readout speed issue. First, with the stacked sensor design like on the A1 and the original A9 and A9 II. Then we got the new global shutter found on the Sony A9 III that gave us full sensor readout speeds in one instant. The issue here though is that these sensor designs are a lot more expensive. That's where the new partially stacked design of the A7V comes in. This new design has much faster readout speeds when compared to a traditional sensor, but not as fast as the higher priced stacked sensors and global shutters. So my first quick test of this was to just take a few images of my kids and see if I could notice any of these jello effects. And amazingly, everything was looking pretty dang good. Even in this picture of my son swinging a rake, there is a bit of motion blur because of my 1/250 the shutter speed, but the rake still looks straight with no jello distortion. So the next thing I did was have my daughter very quickly swing a plastic sword up and down, and here you can start to see a bit of that warping show up in the way the sword bends. For comparison, here is an image of her just holding the sword very still. And it's at this point in my testing that it was time to leave for my trip. And thankfully, the day before we flew out, I got the thumbs up to hold onto the camera for a couple extra days so I could bring it to Aruba, which was exciting, but at the same time made me a little sad because that meant keeping my new beloved RX1 R3 at home because there just wasn't a point in bringing both. But off we went. And for this trip, every single image I took was with the silent shutter. And I guess I should mention that because the camera is so new, there isn't any RAW support from Lightroom. So all the images you see in this video are JPEG images taken with the new Sony film simulations, which has the very unique and intriguing name of Film 2. And on this trip, I was able to take a ton more fast-paced style images to really put the readout speed to the test. So while there was a bit of distortion on that sword image, I think for general everyday moments, this camera readout speed is plenty fast enough. Even this image of my nephew running full speed into the ocean looks totally fine to me. So I think this camera on electronic shutter mode is totally fine for most moving subjects, aside from things like swinging golf clubs or baseball bats. Which leads me into the topic of burst rate, because with the new sensor design also comes the ability to take images at 30 frames per second, which I know a lot of people will instantly compare that to the new Canon R6 Mark III and it's 40 frames per second. But the Canon is limited to 12-bit RAW files, while the Sony can do 30 frames per second, blackout free, and with 14-bit RAW files. For me, I'd rather have the 14-bit RAW files and the slower 30 frames per second, but obviously your use case could be different. Another great thing about this new sensor design is that we now have access to pre-capture and boost mode. So for pre-capture, when it's activated, the camera will constantly capture images, and as soon as you press the shutter, not only will the camera take images as normal, but it will also save all the images it had been capturing before you press the shutter. And what I love about the way Sony has implemented this feature is that you can choose how much time before the shutter you want to capture, from 0.03 seconds to a full second. Because for my uses, a full second is way too long and I don't need that many images. So for me, I usually like to be around the 0.2 and 0.3 seconds when I'm using pre-capture for the things that I usually photograph. Similarly, I rarely need 30 frames per second, and that's where the boost button comes in. What this does is lets you have the camera set to a more reasonable frames per second, like maybe 10, and when you come to an instance where you want more, you press the boost button and it will quickly let you take photos at the max frame rate. My only wish here is that I would have preferred Sony give us the latest body design with the new C5 button on the front of the camera, like the Sony A7 III. But instead, we are getting the body design of the A7R5, which is still a great design, and it comes with the absolute best flipping and tilting screen design on the market. At least in my opinion, it is the best. Another feature I've been begging for is the ability to have custom buttons set so that a button press will cycle through certain options rather than simply bringing up a menu where we then have to select the option we want. I would also love the ability to remove items from the cycle that I know I'll never use. And Sony has sort of like inched its way towards this, and an example of this is with shutter type. There are only two options, electronic and mechanical. So I never understood why when I pressed the custom button to change, it just gave me a menu pop-up where I then had to select what I wanted. Well, now Sony has added the ability to program a custom button to this new option called shutter type switch, where it will now cycle through the two shutter types instead of showing the menu. And they have still left us the option to get the pop-up menu if you prefer that. So while this is nice and it's what I wanted for the shutter type custom button, I'd prefer a better implementation that could also bring in all the other various custom buttons and menu items. But I'm going to have a future video all about this and some other sort of wish list changes that I'd like in a future video. So make sure to subscribe if you are interested in that. So back to the Sony A7V. Another change we see in this model is an update to the processing unit and AI unit. Rather than having multiple processing units, the A7V now has one Bion's XR2 processor with a built-in AI processing unit. This new setup is said to be more efficient, which gives us a more accurate autofocus, color accuracy, and auto white balance stability. It also leads to better battery life, which is now rated for 630 images when using the EVF and 750 images when using the rear screen. And throughout my days using the camera, I used it a decent amount every day, and I never dropped below around 20% on any given day. Even on the day where I did my regular like family documentary stuff, then a little maternity session for my sister-in-law. There we go. Yeah, Blackbird. Followed by some family photos. Even on this more heavy use day, a single charge was enough to get me through the day from wake up to bedtime. And aside from the updated processing unit, another thing Sony has added to help improve usability and battery life is a new screen blackout feature. In the past, if you left your camera on and just let it sit, you could have the camera set up to auto turn off, which means you were conserving maximum battery life, but then had to deal with a slower wake up time to get back to shooting. The other option you had is you could have the camera stay on and the screen to dim to its lowest brightness. This gave you the ability to have the camera always be ready, but at the sacrifice of battery life since the screen was always on. Now, you have the ability to have the camera screen completely turn off while the camera still stays on. This gives you instant wake-up speeds while conserving the maximum battery life. Unfortunately, while the idea is amazing, it doesn't quite work out because of one little flaw in the design. You see, when you have the screen blackout thing set up, the screen turns off after a certain amount of time passes of you not pressing any buttons or doing anything on the camera. But when you have the EVF activated, the camera sees this as you doing something with the camera. So if you set the camera down on a table or leave it on a tripod, the feature works perfect. But if you are wearing the camera, the EVF sensor will be triggered by your body and this stops the feature from ever being activated. So what we need for this to truly work within a real working environment is the option to have the camera go into this screen off mode, even if the EVF is activated. From here, let's talk about video. Now, I don't do a ton of video, so I didn't use it much, but it's a very capable camera for video as well, with the ability to do 7K oversampled, 4K 60 with full pixel readout, which just means the camera won't have to do any type of crop when taking 4K 60 video. It can also do 4K 120 when in Super 35 or 240 in full HD. Other things to note is that while this uses the body design of the A7R5, we no longer have the dual CF Express and SD card combo slots. What we have now is a single combo slot and then one slot that is limited to just SD. And looking at the card slots, they look to be the exact same size, except one just has a different insert that only allows the SD to fit. And I'm sure the internals of the second slot only have what's needed for the SD as well, but it makes you wonder why they just couldn't have given us the normal dual combo slots like on most of their other models. Maybe cost savings, but I can't imagine the cost of these card slot components being that much in comparison to the rest of the camera. And while we lost the dual combo slot, we gained a second USB-C port. So if you are someone that likes to shoot tethered, you no longer need to rely on dummy batteries and things like that in order to keep your camera charged while tethering. And while one port is rated for USB 3.2 Gen 2 and the other is USB 2.0 in terms of data speeds, I found them both to charge the camera at the exact same speeds. Now for the real question, who is this camera for? And in my opinion, this camera is now the ideal wedding camera. It's essentially a higher resolution A9 or A9 II with a higher frame rate, better autofocus, better video, and a better body design, all for a cheaper price tag. Even in comparison to the Sony A1 and A9 III, unless you absolutely need the higher sensor readout speeds of these stacked sensor bodies, or you need that 120 frames per second of the A9 III, this is the more economical choice. And if I didn't use the crazy amazing flash sync speeds of the A9 III, this would be the camera I'd most consider to be my everyday workhorse. And even with the flash sync of the A9 III, I'm still considering getting one of these for everything else aside from when I need those, higher sync speeds. Because for everything else I take images of, the Sony A7V would actually be the better option. It has better dynamic range, lower ISO ability, and is plenty fast enough. But what do you think? Is there a feature or spec you wish was on the A7V that isn't there? Or if you are considering picking one up, what's the feature that has you bringing out the wallet? Lastly, before you scroll off to another A7V review video, I'd love if you'd like and subscribe. I'd also love for you to follow along with me over on Instagram. And if you want to learn more from me, definitely check out my Patreon. As always, links are in the description, and hopefully I'll see you on the next one.